The rope was coarse against An Li's wrists, its fibers biting into her skin with every shiver that racked her body. It was not the cold that made her tremble, though the winter air was a blade against her cheeks. It was the eyes. Hundreds of them, a wall of silent judgment from the citizens of Redemption Creek. They stared at her tattered pink cheongsam, a garment once vibrant with the promise of a new life, now stained with mud and shame. Her crime was hunger. Her sin was desperation. Her husband's grave was barely a month old, the earth still soft, and the pittance he had left was gone. Corcoran, the man who owned the town's saloon and half its soul, stood before her, his face a mask of magnanimous authority. He held the other end of the rope. "This is what becomes of beggars in my town," his voice boomed, carrying across the frozen square. "We do not abide parasites. She was offered honest work. She refused." The work he'd offered was in the back rooms of his saloon, a life of subjugation she would rather die than accept. So she had begged for scraps from the baker, a crust of bread for an empty belly. And for that, she was here, a spectacle of public humiliation. Her gaze fell from the hard faces of the men to the downcast eyes of the women, their hands clutching their shawls, their complicity a palpable force. Her father-in-law, Mr. Chen, stood at the edge of the crowd, his face ashen, his body stooped not with age but with a profound, gutting shame. He could do nothing. Corcoran owned his debt, owned his silence. An Li closed her eyes, the burn of unshed tears freezing on her lashes. She would not give them her sorrow. She would not give them her defeat. She held her head high, the worn silk of her collar brushing against her chin, and met Corcoran's smug gaze with a fire he did not expect. A shift rippled through the crowd, a collective intake of breath. A figure had emerged from the alley beside the smithy, moving with a quiet deliberateness that drew every eye. He was massive, a mountain of a man clad in buckskin and fur, his beard thick with frost and his hair long and wild. A heavy axe was looped at his belt, and the rifle he carried looked like a toy in his enormous hands. This was Jedediah, the trapper who lived in the high peaks and came to town only for supplies, speaking few words and sparing no glances. He moved through the onlookers as if they were mist, his focus locked on the scene at the center of the square. Corcoran's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. "This is town business, trapper. Move along." Jedediah did not stop until he stood directly in front of An Li, his sheer size casting a shadow that swallowed her whole, shielding her from the worst of the stares. He looked down, not at her face, but at the raw red welts on her wrists where the rope dug in. A low sound, something between a growl and a sigh, rumbled in his chest. He lifted his gaze to Corcoran, and his eyes, the color of a winter sky, were flat and hard. "Let her go." The words were not loud, but they cut through the cold air with absolute authority. Corcoran bristled, his grip tightening on the rope. "She's a vagrant and a thief. She'll stand here until sundown as a lesson." Jedediah took another step forward. The crowd shuffled back. "I said," he repeated, his voice dropping even lower, impossibly dangerous, "let her go. Now." Without waiting for a response, he drew a heavy skinning knife from his belt. The blade flashed. With a single fluid motion, he sliced through the rope binding An Li's wrists. The severed ends fell into the dirt. An Li stumbled forward, her hands free, and instinctively caught herself against his solid frame. He didn't flinch. He simply stood, a bulwark between her and the entire town. The silence in the square was absolute, broken only by the sharp whistle of the wind. Corcoran stared at the severed rope in his hand, his face darkening with a fury that contorted his handsome features into something ugly. His authority had been publicly challenged, his spectacle ruined. "You'll regret this, mountain man," he spat, the words venomous. "You and your charity case." Jedediah ignored him completely. His attention was solely on An Li. He gently took her arm, his touch surprisingly careful for a man of his size, and steered her away from the center of the square. The crowd parted for them, a silent sea of uncertainty and fear. No one met their eyes. They were specters passing through their own town. He led her away from the main street, toward the edge of the settlement where the forest began to reclaim the land. He didn't speak, and she didn't have the strength to form words. She simply followed, focusing on the solid presence of his back, a shield against the world that had just tried to break her. He led her to a small, weathered cabin tucked into a stand of pines, smoke curling from its stone chimney. It was his place, his sanctuary. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and guided her inside. The warmth was a physical shock, a wave of relief that made her knees weak. A fire roared in the hearth, casting a golden glow over the simple, clean interior. There was a rough-hewn table, a single chair, and a bed piled high with furs. He gestured toward the fire. "Sit." She obeyed, sinking onto the hearthstones, her frozen limbs beginning to ache as they thawed. He filled a tin cup with water from a bucket and handed it to her. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold it. He knelt before her, his large frame seeming to fill the small cabin, and looked at her wrists. He said nothing, but his expression was grim. He retrieved a small jar of salve and a clean strip of linen, and with an almost clinical gentleness began to clean and dress the rope burns. His touch was firm, steady, and utterly impersonal, yet it was the kindest human contact she had felt in months. When he finished, he finally met her eyes. "You're safe now." For 2 days, An-Li barely moved from the hearth. She slept under a mountain of furs, the deep, exhausted sleep of someone who had forgotten what it felt to be safe. Jedediah was a quiet presence, moving about the cabin with an economy of motion, tending the fire, preparing simple meals of salted meat and hard biscuits, which he would leave for her on the table without a word. He seemed to understand that she needed silence more than comfort, space more than solace. He never asked what happened, never asked about her husband or her past. He simply existed, a guardian at the edge of her grief. On the third morning there was a tentative knock at the door. Jedediah opened it to reveal Mr. Chin, her father-in-law. The old man looked smaller than ever, his face a road map of worry. He clutched a small, cloth-wrapped bundle in his hands. He would not look at Jedediah, his eyes fixed on An-Li by the fire. I have brought food," he stammered, his voice thin and reedy. "Some rice, dried fish." Jedediah stepped aside, allowing him to enter. Mr. Chin approached An-Li and set the bundle down carefully. He finally raised his eyes to meet hers, and they were filled with a terrible, swimming shame. "I am sorry, An-Li. I am a weak man, a coward." His voice broke. "Corcoran, he holds my debts, my store. He said if I interfered, he would take everything. He would cast me out." An-Li looked at the man who should have been her protector, the father of the man she had loved. She felt no anger, only a vast, weary pity. "You feared for yourself," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. "I feared for what little I have left," he confessed, his shoulders slumping. "My son, he would be ashamed of me." He looked around the sparse cabin, at the giant of a man watching them from the shadows. "This man, he has more honor than I." An-Li slowly pushed herself to her feet, her legs still unsteady. She picked up the bundle of food. "Thank you for the rice, Father." The word father hung in the air, a ghost of a life that was gone. She did not offer forgiveness. She did not offer comfort. She offered only a quiet, resolute acknowledgement. Her survival was her own now. He had made his choice in the square, and she was making hers now. The next morning, An-Li put on the simple wool dress Jedediah had left for her. It was too big, but it was warm and clean. She folded her tattered pink cheongsam with deliberate care and placed it in a small wooden chest. It was a symbol of her past, of both her dreams and her humiliation, and she was not yet ready to discard it. She found Jedediah outside, splitting firewood with powerful, rhythmic swings of his axe. The crisp air was filled with the scent of pine and cold earth. He stopped when he saw her, resting the axe head on the chopping block. "I am not staying here," she said, her voice clear and stronger than it had been in days. He watched her, his expression unreadable. "Where will you go?" She squared her shoulders. "My husband, Bao, he bought a small piece of land before he died, just at the north edge of town, a broken-down shack and a half-acre of weeds. Corcoran thinks he can scare everyone away from it. He wants it, but it is mine." Jedediah nodded slowly. "It's a hard place. The gate is broken, the roof leaks." She met his gaze without flinching. "Then I will fix the gate, and I will fix the roof." A flicker of something, respect perhaps, passed through his eyes. "You'll need tools." He said nothing more. He simply wiped his hands, went into a small shed beside the cabin, and returned with a heavy hammer, a small saw, and a leather pouch of nails. He placed them in her hands. They were heavy, solid, real. "I have a few boards from a shed that collapsed last winter. I can bring them by," he offered, his tone matter of fact. It was not an offer to do the work for her. It was an offer of resources, a recognition of her intent. He was giving her the means to fight her own battle. As she walked toward the path leading back to the town, he spoke again, his voice carrying on the still air. "Corcoran won't like it." An Lee paused and looked back at him, the tools feeling like weapons in her hands. "I am not doing it for Corcoran to like," she replied. "I am doing it for me." She saw the barest hint of a smile touch the corner of his mouth before it vanished into his beard. The shack was worse than she remembered. It was a skeletal structure, leaning tiredly against the wind. The gate to the small, overgrown yard hung from a single rusted hinge. This was her inheritance. This was her kingdom. An Lee set down the tools and surveyed the task. The gate was the first thing people saw. It was a statement. A broken gate said weakness, abandonment. A fixed gate said someone was home. Someone was staying. She started with the hinge, her fingers clumsy and numb with cold as she tried to work the old nails free. The work was brutally difficult. The wood was splintered, the metal rusted fast. But with every failed attempt, a stubborn fire grew in her belly. This was not about a gate. This was about drawing a line in the dirt and declaring her ground. As she worked, a shadow fell over her. Corcoran. He sat astride his fine black horse, looking down at her with an expression of amused contempt. Two of his saloon heavies flanked him. "Well, look at this," he drawled, his voice slick with mockery. "The beggar has become a carpenter. Did your mountain man give you that hammer, little bird?" An Lee ignored him, focusing on a particularly stubborn nail. "You're wasting your time," Corcoran continued, his tone hardening. "This land is worthless, and it's an eyesore. The town council will be hearing about it." She finally pulled the nail free with a grunt of effort and a shower of rust. She looked up at him, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes clear and direct. "This land is mine." His smile vanished. "Nothing in this town is yours unless I say it is. You would do well to remember that. Pack up your things and be gone by the end of the week, or I'll have you removed. Properly this time." He wheeled his horse around, kicking up a spray of mud that spattered her dress. As he rode away, she saw a young Chinese woman, Su Yin, who did laundry for the saloon, watching from the road, her face pale with fear before she scurried away. An Lee looked from the retreating figures to the broken gate. His threat did not fill her with fear. It filled her with fuel. Just then she heard the steady tread of heavy boots. Jedediah appeared, a stack of weathered planks balanced on one broad shoulder. He set them down without a word, his eyes following Corcoran's departure. "He said you won't like this," An Li said quietly, picking up her hammer. Jedediah grunted. He was right. An Li did not work alone for long. The day after Corcoran's threat, Mr. Chen appeared at the broken gate, his hands empty but his face set with a new, fragile resolve. He did not apologize again. He simply picked up the saw. "My son was a good boy," he said, his voice thick. "He would want his wife to have a home. Show me where to cut." The work was slow, but they worked together, the quiet sounds of hammering and sawing filling the cold air. Later that day, Su Yin, the young laundress, approached hesitantly, carrying a small pot of warm broth. She bowed her head. "We saw what you were doing," she whispered, indicating the other Chinese families who eked out a living on the fringes of the town. "We are afraid, but we are also hopeful." An Li took the broth, its warmth seeping into her hands. "Fear does not mend a gate, Su Yin, but hands do." The next evening, 2 more men from the Chinese community came, bringing lanterns and their own tools. They did not speak of Corcoran. They spoke of the coming winter, of patching the roof, of building a community where before there had been only isolated islands of fear. Jedediah continued to be a silent, steady presence. He would bring supplies, more nails, tar for the roof, a sack of potatoes, and would often stay, working alongside the others. During these shared hours of labor, a quiet bond formed between him and An Li. It wasn't built on words, but on shared purpose. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, they stood together, looking at the newly hung gate. It was sturdy, functional, and defiant. He noticed her rubbing her hands, chapped and sore from the work. He reached out and gently took one of her hands in his calloused palm enveloping hers. His touch was warm and protective. "You have good hands," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Strong." She didn't pull away. For the first time she felt not just safe, but seen. She looked down at their joined hands, his large and weathered, hers small but capable. "They are learning," she replied softly. In the fading light, their shared silence was more intimate than any conversation. Their small victory was short-lived. A week later, the town magistrate, a portly, sweating man named Barrow, who was seldom seen without Corcoran, nailed a notice to the new gate. The paper was crisp, the ink a stark, official black. It was an eviction order. It cited a previously unknown town ordinance against unseemly and dilapidated structures, and declared the property condemned. They had 3 days to vacate before the town would seize the land and demolish the shack. It was a declaration of war, wrapped in the thin veil of legality. The small group of helpers who had gathered around An Li fell into a panicked silence. This was not a fight against a bully. This was a fight against the law, against the very structure of the town. "He owns the magistrate, mister," Chen said, his voice heavy with defeat. "He owns the law. We cannot win." Su Yin began to weep quietly. "We should not have done this. We have angered him." An Li pulled the notice from the gate, the nail screeching in protest. She read the words again, her jaw tightening. She had been shamed, threatened, and now she was being erased by a piece of paper. She turned to face her small, terrified community. "He uses the law because he is afraid to use his own hands," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that cut through their despair. "He thinks this paper is stronger than our hammers. He thinks his ink is stronger than our sweat." She looked from face to face, her gaze lingering on each one. "We built this gate. We will patch this roof. This is our home. We will not be moved by a coward's words." That night she took out the folded pink Cheongsam. With a pair of shears, she carefully cut a long, clean strip from the silk. It was the last undamaged part of the dress. She took it outside to the gate, where Jedediah was standing watch, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm. He watched as she tied the strip of pink silk to the top of the gate post. It fluttered in the night wind, a soft, defiant banner, a whisper of beauty against the harshness of the world. "A flag?" he asked. "A promise," she answered, looking up at him, "to my husband and to myself, that this place will be a home." The morning of the eviction dawned cold and gray. A nervous quiet hung over Redemption Creek. By mid-morning, a crowd had started to gather, their curiosity and morbid anticipation drawing them toward An Lee's property. They kept their distance, a silent ring of spectators waiting for the inevitable conclusion. Corcoran arrived on his horse, flanked by Magistrate Barrow and 3 grim-faced men he'd hired for the task. They carried crowbars and heavy sledges. They were not here to serve a notice. They were here to demolish a life. But as they approached the gate, they stopped. An Lee stood on the small porch of the shack, her back straight, her head held high. On her right stood Jedediah, his presence a silent, immovable threat. On her left stood Mr. Chin, no longer stooped, his fear replaced by a quiet dignity. Behind them, arrayed in a line, were Su Yin and the other half-dozen members of the Chinese community. They were armed with nothing but their own resolve. They stood before their home, a human wall. The pink silk ribbon on the gatepost fluttered bravely in the breeze. "This is your final warning," Barrow called out, his voice trembling slightly. "This is a legal eviction. Disperse at once." An Lee stepped forward. Her voice was not loud, but it carried with an intensity that commanded the attention of every person there. "Magistrate, what law did I break?" Barrow fumbled with his papers. "The ordinance for dilapidated structures." "The one written 3 days ago in Mr. Corcoran's office?" she countered, her voice sharp. A murmur went through the crowd. "This structure is being repaired by this community. The only crime here is one man's greed." She turned her gaze on Corcoran, pinning him with it. "You tried to shame me for being hungry. You threatened me for wanting a home. Now you hide behind a false law because you are a coward. You do not own this town. You do not own its people. And you do not own me." A profound silence fell. Then a voice from the crowd, the blacksmith, a man who had watched her humiliation in the square. "She's right," he said, his voice rough but clear. "The woman's just trying to make a life for herself. Leave her be, Corcoran." Another voice joined in, then another. The wall of silent complicity had finally cracked. Corcoran looked from An Lee's defiant face to the shifting, murmuring crowd. His power, built on fear and silence, was evaporating before his eyes. He had lost. Without a word, he yanked the reins of his horse and rode away, his hired men and the humiliated magistrate trailing in his wake. The crowd dispersed slowly, thoughtfully, the confrontation leaving a permanent mark on the town's conscience. The victory was quiet, heavy with meaning. On the porch, Su Yin embraced An Lee, tears of relief streaming down her face. Mr. Chin placed a hand on his daughter-in-law's shoulder, his eyes shining with a pride he had never been able to show his own son. One by one, the small band of defenders went back to their lives, leaving An Lee and Jedediah alone in the quiet aftermath. The pink ribbon still danced on the gate. An Lee walked over to it, her fingers tracing the soft silk. She had turned an object of her deepest shame into a symbol of her greatest strength. Jedediah came to stand beside her, his nearness a familiar comfort. "It's over," she said, more to herself than to him. "For now," he corrected gently. "Men like Corcoran don't forget." "Neither do I," she replied, a new hardness in her voice. She looked at the shack, at the sturdy gate, at the small patch of land that was unequivocally hers. It wasn't just a property anymore. It was a sanctuary, forged in defiance and cemented by community. She turned to face him, the vastness of her gratitude, and something more, something deeper and more fragile, showing in her eyes. I would not have been able to do this without you, Jedediah. He looked down at her, his gaze soft. The harsh lines of his face seemed gentle in her presence. You did this, Anli. You found your voice. You reminded them of their own. He reached out, his fingers brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. His touch lingered, a spark of warmth against her skin. What will you do now? He asked. I will finish the roof before the snows come, she said, a small smile gracing her lips for the first time. And I will plant a garden in the spring. The future, once a terrifying void, was now a space she could fill with her own choices. And you? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. What will you do? He looked from her face to the distant snow-capped mountains that were his home, then back to her. A long, silent moment passed between them. The mountains are lonely in the winter, he said, his voice a low rumble. Maybe I'll stay a while, help with that roof. It was not a declaration of love, but it was a promise of presence, of a shared future built not on grand words, but on the simple, solid act of rebuilding together.